Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to this week's Griscom stream. Got a lot of fun stuff coming. We got Barack Obama. We got an interesting study that came out from Jackman. I think we might want to do more on it in a little bit, and a few more. And of course, taking your questions from the chat. So welcome everybody. I'm hanging out here today. I usually say it's a beautiful day here, but it's a little bit gray here in Austin, Texas. Hope it's well wherever you're at. Tomorrow, we're going to be joined by Paul Bowers, who runs a really great Substack called Brutal South. And he's going to be joining us to talk about South Carolina, a little bit of the history and the politics and the political economy of the state, but also specifically why this sort of, smaller southern state has such an outsized influence on American politics. We're going to be looking at people like Nikki Haley in particular to break that down. I've really been looking forward to this. For folks who are unfamiliar, I lived in South Carolina for a while, went to high school there. So really excited to have somebody on to sort of talk about what's going on in that state and hearing some on-the-ground reporting. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So that's tomorrow at Wednesday. Tomorrow Wednesday at 7 Central. We got a lot more coming up for the rest of the month. But before we get too far, these are more casual. So I'm taking questions from the chat, both on the Twitch and the YouTube chat. So I'll be monitoring both of those. So feel free to jump in with any kind of questions that are reasonable, and I'll try to answer them as well. These are a little bit more conversations than, long segments aren't anything. But yeah, maybe we could start with Fidel while we're getting warmed up. I just came across these photographs, and I'd sort of forgotten about this sort of interesting story. I mean, people probably know that before the United States started to treat Fidel Castro as enemy number one, there was a period of time where Fidel was welcomed into the United States as a hero and a freedom fighter, like he was welcomed across the East Coast. He also showed up in Houston, Texas, and that sort of has left some kind of interesting photographic memories of this trip. I can pull some of them up for y'all now. Fidel comes to Houston, and he is welcomed almost immediately. It's great, fanfare. I mean, people were meeting him at the airport. Super excited to see him. And let me get some of these pictures if you haven't seen them, because there's something else. So this is Fidel. This is Fidel at a dinner, smoking his signature cigar. And he has this Stetson hat that he apparently was gifted immediately upon landing in Texas, and wore the entire time that he was here. And I have some more pictures we can sort of go through. I don't know the best way to share them, but go old school. No, it wasn't in Dallas. It was in Houston, Texas. This is in 1959. So a couple months after he becomes prime minister. He was hanging out in Houston. Let me see. I got a lot of. He was hanging out in Houston. Let me see. Some of these pictures are sort of fun. This is Fidel, and I believe I'd have to verify this, but I believe he's also gifted this horse I'm about to show to you all in 1 second. But I mean, the pictures are interesting. One, because it sort of captures, a very specific moment in U.S. history, and specifically, American-Cuban relations. But I also wanted to make a kind of larger point about the kind of ideological operations that they had to do against Fidel in the U.S. because, who he sort of was and what he represented is a story that I think actually speaks to a lot of Americans. Well, let me show you all. So we have, okay, I just showed you all this one of Fidel smoking a cigar. So he's eating barbecue in this photograph, apparently. I've been trying to figure out, it looks like it's pulled pork. So I don't know what's going on there. But this horse, for example, you can see some comrades, you can tell them by their large beards, are hanging out with him. Apparently this horse was a gift. He was able to bring that back to Cuba with him. Here's him sort of schmoozing with some folks at dinner. I know he met with a Houston oil tycoon and a couple other business leaders to sort of try to set up investment in Cuba. This is him, trying to finish up his barbecue, all while wearing his signature Stetson. And this is the last photograph right here. But yeah, it's a fun story, and it's certainly interesting, just compared to the way that most people sort of a lot of people have a hard time actually believing and, and understanding there was a time when Cuba wasn't sort of vilified in this way, in the way that it currently is. Um, but he was welcomed to the country as a hero. This is before the Declaration of Havana. Um, yeah, he was Frank Water. Wanted to make a movie about Fidel, starring Marlon Brando and Frank Sinatra, which never got made. But it's interesting to read the kind of early reports of Fidel and the way it was sort of seen in the United States. In the New York Times, they wrote about the kind of fervor and excitement that people had when they had met Fidel in his first tour, his major tour of the United States. This is quoting from this New York Times reporter who's following around, saying about Fidel, not only out of another world, the world of fierce Latin passion. You can see the dated kind of language there, but also out of another century, the century of Sam Adams and Patrick Henry and Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson, perhaps, because he stirred memories long dimmed of a revolutionary past and recalled a new order once deeply felt. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Fidel Castro succeeded in achieving a suspension of belief, at least partial and temporary. And that's the kind of thing. So like people, when they were meeting Fidel in Houston, they were dressing up their kids as young, like Cuban revolutionaries. I mean, that's the kind of thing, that maybe about 5-6 years later, if you were to do that, you'd sort of be thrown out of polite society. But it's only because they had to do such ideological war against the Cuban Revolution, Fidel, and what that movement truly represented, right? Because the American story, the ideology that we're sort of taught here, it could easily be seen in a revolution against an out of touch dictator. I mean, that's fundamentally the way that most Americans see the American Revolution, right? Was that people standing up against an authoritarian and unjust system, and it took so much ideological work and really just creating the kind of red menace, ideology that started to dominate American political culture to sort of dispel Americans of that kind of belief of the rough and ragged revolutionary standing up for the people, right? Because that is a story and a message that very much resonates with American people. And it had to they had to sort of create the communist boogeyman to be able to justify the fact that everywhere we saw people sort of standing up and trying to take control of their political system for the people against out of touch authoritarians, entrenched aristocracy, etc. The United States stood with the old powers, the aristocratic powers, the entrenched authoritarian states, right? Like that's the role that the American government played throughout the second half of the 20th century. And they had to do a lot of ideological work on the American population to sort of dispel, kind of brotherhood that I think a lot of American people sort of were showing with those early on revolutionaries. Well, let's see what y'all are. I don't. LBJ would organize the dinner for Fidel for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's just I think it's worthwhile to note though that when we sort of reinvestigate American history and American pop culture and popular imagination, etc. Just remember that there was a shitload of ideological work that had to be done to turn American people against these kind of popular revolutions that we were seeing in the 20th century, right? There was an incredible amount of ideological lift that they had to do because there's something that feels very much a part of the the American ideological tradition to fight against oppression, and it sort of is a sad reminder of how much work how successful they were able to do when you see the early way that people were reacting to the Cuban Revolution. Yeah, Dakota says Frank Sinatra's Fidel in a movie I would have loved to see. I think they want Marlon Brando to be Fidel, actually. Marlon Brando to be Fidel, and Sinatra to be Raul. So that would have been interesting as well. Well, let's see. I'm happy to take any questions. We have some Obama stuff we can get to in a couple minutes, along with I have some stuff from Dustin Guastella and Matt Karp that they put out today, earlier today in The Guardian, sort of reporting on a big study that they did along with Jackman did along with like YouGov, and I'm forgetting the other polling organization. But let's see. David, are you looking forward to enrolling in the University of Austin? I'll tell you one thing. It doesn't seem like many of those people, thank God, and don't y'all start bullying them about this. I started seeing people bullying them about this yesterday. It doesn't seem like a lot of those folks who are sort of going to be on staff at the fake school, the University of Austin, are actually going to relocate here. I'm pretty sure it's going to be Zoom seminars for a long, long while until the grift stops. The grift stops working. I mean, it's a joke. And I think enough has been said at this point. I had to mute all that stuff on Twitter because I was just sort of exhausted with seeing it. It's amazing to me when you see like their reasoning for why they're locating, starting that university is that Elon Musk and Joe Rogan are here. It's incredible to me and sort of depressing, frankly, that so much of what's happening here, the associations that people have with Austin now are, sort of being created by folks who have a very passing interest in this place and certainly have no deep roots. Here I'm talking about Rogan and Musk and those kind of characters, right? So it's sort of sad to see like them acting as as polls sort of attracting people like Barry Weiss and Pinker to the city. Again, I don't think that those people are actually going to be moving here. It doesn't seem like they are. I think that because a lot of them are continuing to stay on their university positions. That's the thing that's so funny too, is so many of the people who are allegedly staff again at this, essentially which is just going to be a really expensive Zoom seminar program. They're all maintaining their university positions at like major universities elsewhere, right? And it's funny enough, making the point too that all of these people are like essentially university administrators already. Talking about, I've been kicked out of education. There's no room in education for these kind of ideas. I mean, these are the people who have the power in the university system in the first place. So yeah, I don't know. I can't like continue getting worked up about whatever kind of weird grift people sort of are wanting to associate with Austin, because there's always some weirdo now online talking about how they're going to move here or do something here, and very rarely do they seem to pan out. And when they do start to show up, they don't really get rooted because nobody wants to hang out with people like that. And those, people like Musk, he doesn't really want to be in Austin per se. He wants to have a tax base here so that he can avoid income taxes. Yeah. Well, let's see. More than happy to do some questions. If not, we can play some Obama. Well, actually, before we do Obama, I wanted to sort of go through this report that came out from Jackman, from the Working Class Politics Center. Right? I'm sorry, what are they calling it? It's a new organization that they've set up. Again, if people aren't familiar, you should definitely be reading Matt Karp and Dustin Guastella whenever you're able to see his work around. We did some really great interviews with him on TMBS that I very much enjoyed being a part of. But this study came out earlier today, and let me pull it up right quick. Here we go. This came out earlier today, and I think it has some interesting, especially in the context of what we saw last week, and everyone making these kind of grand pronouncements about what how the Democratic Party has gone so far to the left, etc. The fact is that it seems much more than anything that people are not very inspired or interested in these kind of woke centrist candidates like McAuliffe. And the Democratic Party's like brand and political movement is so weak at this point that it can get beat by like very, very vague um, culture war shit like CRT, right? Which effectively at this point, I said this on the show last week, effectively at this point, that conception of CRT, how it's like infecting our schools, etc., right? It's so vague and so meaningless. People are able to sort of import whatever meaning they want into it. And I think it's absolutely worthwhile to push back against the boogeyman, certainly coming at the extreme reactionary grifters who are sort of popping up as like the anti-CRT group. And so I'm not saying that it's not important to sort of confront those lies and the nonsense around it. I also have said too that I think that it's sort of a shame that because the right wing is so fixated on creating this insane out of touch boogeyman, that it puts people like especially in the Marxist and socialist left in a weird position of like trying to say like, okay, well the CRT stuff that you're freaking out about is nonsense, but like the actual discipline, like the actual um, movements, like there are some deviations and sort of tensions with CRT proper, like it's like an ideological as like a school of thought, and like socialism and Marxism and debates and things like that I think are really worth engaging in, but we have to spend so much time putting out this right-wing fire. Anyways, the point here is that while there's all this like really actual material stuff that we can go through regarding CRT, and it's important to push back against the right-wing lies, etc., the fact is that you have to be able to beat the nonsense that the right is putting forward. I talked about this last week, but everyone was dunking on that older guy in Virginia who was saying that he thought that the most important like topic in that election was CRT. But when he was asked if he could define it or describe it or identify something about it, he was unable to do so. Right. And everyone was sort of like, look at this win. It's like, when in fact, that's a loss, right? When they're able to put forward something that is so kind of nebulous that even the people who are saying like, I'm going out and spending time in my day to go and vote for somebody, right? To vote for another one of these rich assholes over the other rich asshole. And they're able to win with something that the people who are doing it don't even really recognize or understand what it is that they're talking about. That means you're losing, and you're losing big time. And again, like the left's, the socialist job should not be saving the Democratic Party from itself. But I think that when we were talking about electoral strategy, etc., being able to recognize that is really, really critical. But let me see. I wanted to share this right quick with you all. Because this was an interesting piece that came out, and we'll probably do more on the study sometime in the near future. But Dustin Guastella and Matt Karp, who was a guest on Left Reckoning as well, put out a piece sort of breaking down the study in Guardian magazines called "Message to Democrats: Embrace Economic Bread and Butter Issues to Win." And they talk here early on about how Manchin sort of puts the challenge to everybody about how liberals need to be electing more liberals if they want to do what they want. We can let that sort of lie as it is. But this poll that came out with from Jackman Magazine, YouGov, and the team at the Center for Working Class Politics looked into, interviewed a bunch of different working class folks, and sort of tested out different messaging with people and sort of templates of candidates, so you could sort of identify what works and what is attractive to these groups versus others. And the thing that were found were pretty interesting. One, that people are very. Let me see if I can get some of these quotes up here. What we learned in the Common Sense Solidarity Report may confound both sides of the ongoing debate. The strongest candidates in our sample made bread and butter issues their top priorities, jobs and the economy, rather than immigration and racial justice, and spoke about those priorities in universalist rather than woke identity-centered rhetoric. These differences were even more pronounced among the working class voters that Democrats and progressives have struggled most to reach, including rural and small town voters and voters in blue collar jobs. In this sense, our findings support the view that working class voters are sensitive to candidate messaging, and that progressives who want to win their support should put economic issues at the center of their campaigns. But does that mean that Democrats must either tack hard to the center or abandon their effort to win back a fundamentally conservative working class, as some analysts have argued? Not all. And this is the maybe we could talk about this. I want to check the chat, so feel free to start putting things in here and responses to this. I saw a kind of backlash about this study, and I had a hard time sort of wrapping my head around what it was that people were upset about. I understood that some people were upset by the way that this study sort of was trying to identify working class voters, right? But I think the most of those criticisms were very tenuous, right? Because I'm sorry if you think that these folks, the people who are working on this project, right, are not, for example, familiar with Eric Olin Wright's work on the topic of who is and isn't in the working class, right? I think you're making a big you're making a mistake there. People were mad because essentially most of the published results, the results that people are sort of basing their claims on from this piece, are on this distinction between college educated and non-college educated voters. And look, I think that there are plenty of sociological arguments that we can be making about these things. But the fact is when you look at the electorate and you look at what's been happening, not just with the Democratic Party in the United States, but with socialist and social democratic parties in Europe, those are the demographics that have sort of been left behind by these center left parties, right? And within those groups, you have seen the largest shifts in the United States is quite clear, and it's across all racial groups, by the way. A trend towards the Republican Party, right? And starting to identify why this matters is going to be really critical for gaining these for winning these elections that we need to be doing if we want to be building mass politics in the United States. Now, put a pin in that for a second. I'm going to check the chat to hear what people have to say in response to that, if there's any response to that. But I wanted to identify. So, I wanted to point to this one because I think the study is interesting, and two, because I thought the backlash was sort of confusing to me. Right, because so there's some people who are mad at that kind of definition because it's not inherently Marxist enough, and I think that it's more than fair to say that when we're sort of making theoretical arguments, that there is certainly it is not as clear cut to say that college educated versus non-college educated is the class divided in the United States. I don't think that that's even what the people who put together this study are saying. But in the U.S. media, those are the kind of shorthand. That's the shorthand that people use to describe working class versus non-working class voters. And when you are seeing these mass shifts in that population, which is a significant part of the American population, and a very important part of the American population, if you want to start winning with working class populist politics, I don't understand why sort of investigating what people are saying within those communities is somehow a bad thing. Because I think there's a hesitation that some people have that what they're going to get from this study is going to be a recommendation that, okay, well, what we need to do is have people who say we want to fight for higher minimum wage and Medicare for all, but we're going to be socially conservative on all of these different issues. And you know what? That is not what the study found, right? Does this mean that Democrats must either tack hard to the center or abandon their effort to win back a fundamentally conservative working class, as some analysts have argued? Because this is the big popular argument right now. And by the way, I'm sorry, if you care about the direction that this country is going, and you want the left to sit out this argument, right? For some reason, you're also making a big mistake, because the people who the Democratic Party listen to are saying that they've gotten too progressive on social issues, and they're telling them to start pulling back on some of their messaging on these things. The voters in our sample preferred candidates who endorse Medicare for all to those who supported an anodyne centrist alternative. And given a choice of political messages, they chose a populist Bernie Sanders soundbite pitting working class Americans against wealthy elites somewhat more often than a moderate Biden-style message. Nor does our study suggest that Democrats must play it safe by avoiding discussions of racism. working class respondents strongly backed candidates who promised to end systemic racism over those who offered a bland pronouncement of equal rights for all. They did not punish female or non-white candidates. In fact, Black candidates performed significantly better than any other group in our sample, even among white voters. Working class voters will not punish candidates for advocating for civil rights. But when Democrats frame the struggle in a way that overshadows their commitment to delivering bread and butter goods, and when they adopt an activist inspired, identity based rhetoric, they are likely to lose working class voters. Our survey turned up some very large gaps on this front. A populist candidate with a central focus on the economy earned 63% support. For example, while moderates and woke progressives with a focus on immigration or racial justice won under 50%. Right? These are significant differences. And the point here is not, and this is what just eludes me by some of the people whose like immediate knee-jerk reaction was to freak out about this study, is that nobody is saying to drop these issues, right? But rather there is a kind of cultural way of talking about these things that makes things that people sort of experience and understand around them seem like you are purposefully trying to abstract them, right? There is a lot of kind of language and rhetoric that is put forward by people like AOC, for example, that only speaks to a very specific segment of the population, right? Which has a lot more to do with your kind of cultural leanings, or how close you are to university systems at this point. Than whether or not you want to deal with systemic racism in the US, right? And that's the fundamental lesson here for us if we want to be starting to build politics that can win, is rather than being so attached, right, to certain kind of cultural signalings within our in-group, actually being attached to material politics that benefits and attacks and comes at those systems of white supremacy and racism, etc., right? Like start coming at those systems directly rather than sort of trying to find ways to paint things in a different kind of rhetoric, which signals to other people that you get it, right? Because I'll tell you, a lot of that language makes things that people already understand seem foreign and abstract. And one thing that really hurts you when you talk to people, just in general, is when it seems like you are trying to obscure something from them. So again, this study I think is very interesting, and I think is actually very promising for the future of left politics. In what it's showing, that the things that we want are very popular, right? And we can actually build the coalitions that we need to. And we need to find ways to, one, convince people that we can win, to put ourselves into the point where people are actually considering left candidates as the serious candidates, and to not just get so attractive to kind of subcultural stuff that unfortunately seems to dominate not just like the left, but a lot of progressive columnists and pundits, etc. But yeah, I think if we could, I'd like to do some more on this in the future, and I'm curious to hear Matt's thoughts on it too. But I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything from the chat. So let me come up there. So I'm not seeing anything in the Twitch, but there's certainly a lot going on in YouTube. So let me read some of these. Did you see the question about the names of the other folks in the photo with Fidel? The other people with Fidel, there's different folks. I mean, some of those people were actual, like one of them was a Houston oil tycoon. I mean, these were people who were sort of invited by the city to meet with Fidel. So they were sort of actual wealthy folks, which is why it's sort of interesting. All right, let me see. I'm going to come back to our friend here who sent me a super chat. Thank you so much, on inflation. But I want to make sure that we're not missing anything in response to this. All right. Yeah, Champagne says, Champagne Humanist, he changed your name, said specific language makes a difference. Who would have thunk it? Exactly. It seems, let me read this. It feels as if many of the people who freak out about class reductionism are really just opposed to ever getting to economic change. I don't know where the kind of reaction lives. I think there's some of it that is ideological. I think With some people, it's personal, but I don't know. Again, I think that a lot of the class reductionists freak out. Um, I never truly understood it, and I think as Ben says, like there probably are some people on Reddit who are true class reductionists, but actually point me to where these arguments, who's actually saying these things, and we have a conversation about them. Again, I think that there is um, unfortunately a disconnect with the way that all these things are talked about, even just in left media, and what most people actually believe on these things. Because the thing is, like the way a lot of people talk about the American working class is that it's like a movement of reactionaries. The fact is, the American working class is extremely progressive. Compared to even other like Western European societies on all of these issues. Doesn't mean that they're perfect and that there's not struggles to be had within that class, but I'm saying recognize where we are. What people seem to be allergic to is a certain way of framing these things that is exclusive to a very it's not even just like college educated versus non-college educated, a very specific kind of activist language. Again, I think that it's worth being able to wrestle with this stuff. Like it's like if people were actually saying what the Democrats are saying, and this is what the Democratic strategists are telling them: drop these fights for equity and fairness, and start trending in a more conservative direction on social issues. You've gone too far on the social issues, right? That's what people are being told within the Democratic Party from people who they give, who they spend millions of dollars to sort of feel out the actual opinions of the working class. What this study actually showed is that no, people actually do want justice and equity for people in the society, but there is a way that has been presented to them that for right or wrong reasons has sort of just poisoned the well for folks. And so instead of being so attached to certain ways of presenting ourselves, we should be attached to actually getting victories for folks. I don't know. I don't know why that's difficult for some people to sort of wrestle their head around. Um, Jen Pan had a good segment about how there's no place for economic left and culturally moderate voters. Yeah, I mean, God, I'm sorry, it keeps on going down as I'm reading it. Alienating discourse that just reflects your cultural traits are not baked into the cake. Um, Speaking of nurses, TRNN reported that 35,000 Kaiser workers have set a date for strike for November 15th. That's exciting. Champagne Humanist that had to change it for work. That's amazing. Um, Okay, I'm gonna come back down to this part in the chat in a second. I want to make sure that I'm not skipping out on um sorry, I'm trying to read. I feel like this is from Twitch. I feel like America had such a libertine streak in politics that some leftists have no faith in working class politics generally. Yeah, I mean, I think that comes also from like a kind of old school American anarchist movement too, right? That was, not always interested in building those kind of mass politics, but actually having like and when I mean American anarchist, I mean like I think less so like political or ideological anarchists and more this kind of like fuck the system, um pop culture version of like, I mean, Austin, Texas is a great example of this. Watch the movie Slacker for examples of this kind of conspiratorial, the system's broken, but not really having any faith in people for pushing back, just sort of like, oh, I witnessed it, that the system sucks kind of attitude. I think a lot of that is still very pervasive on the US left, and now post Bernie, I think that a lot of people who were sort of just going with the through the motions with everybody else are starting to reveal that kind of fundamental belief. But that's just a hypothesis. I want to make sure that I'm going to come back to these questions in a second. But Ken and Via said thoughts on the inflation talk, how it connects to the regular voter seeing store prices go up, and how we can take the correct narrative back. Well, I think that taking the inflation stuff seriously is really important, because what it means politically, right, when this kind of discourse starts dominating in the US, is that there is going to be policy responses from the big bourgeoisie, right, from our opponents in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to start trying to pull back spending. Um, when it comes to people having, affordability issues, I think that there's a couple things that we can be doing in messaging. One is, again, advocating what we've been saying for a long time, is everybody has been entitled for wage increases for a long ass time, and we need to be seeing more of that, and remind people where inflation resides. What do I mean by that? Who makes the decision to increase prices on goods and services? Is it the workers? How many times in your life as a working person have you said, I want the price at the store that I work at to go up, or I want the price of beer at the bar that I work at to go up by $1 or 2? You don't ever get that. You don't ever get that position. That's your boss, right? So when we're talking about inflation, the way that our opponents try to frame it in a lot of ways is that working people have gotten it too good, and that means that we're going to have inflation, right? No. What inflation, when we're seeing, especially in consumer goods and in things like places like the grocery store, apart from things that are just like sort of direct responses to mass shortages, etc., that is a conscious decision by business owners to increase the prices of their goods. And why are they doing that? Because they still think that they have the ability to. Anytime that you might see a moderate wage gain for working people, that the bosses refuse to take any kind of loss in their profits. So they push their prices up, right? And understanding that as a deliberate decision by those people puts it in a kind of political arena where we can start to do class politics instead of the way that it's presented in the U.S. It's just sort of like, I don't know, a natural reaction of the system, right? No, these are deliberate choices by people. All right, let me see. Um, um, Radium says, "How do you defend your position people who dislike it without hiding distasteful ideology?" I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. Um, if you ask that again, I can try to answer it, but I don't understand that question. Um, all right, let me see. Where is Matt? Need him to regulate on the chat for those who don't know what libertarian socialism means. These Tuesdays are just me. You'll see Matt tomorrow for sure. Okay. I'm keeping up with the chat now. I'm up to date. Cozy Boy wants to know, churches, synagogues, and mosques are some of the few communities that remain after the individualization and alienation we've seen. I think we had to pursue the organization of religious people where they are at. There are proud socialist histories in Christianity and Judaism and Islam. I feel like this is a neglected area right now on the left. What are your thoughts? No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's something that I've been advocating for a long time. I mean, it was something that Michael did too, right? They're proud Christian socialist traditions, and I think that that is a good thing. I don't think that there's any problem with wanting to negotiate that. The problem right now is that, and this is like one of the early points about like culture that Marx makes, is that capitalism starts to eradicate those older social structures that sort of predated capitalism. And you're seeing it even with churches, for example, in the United States. I mean, I'm here in Texas, and I know this is not unique here. But we have these big ass mega churches, or even like not even like the big ones, like the Joel Osteen ones, but those insane ones that are, in the strip malls, and it's kind of, gospel of wealth, right? Something where a very clear neoliberal ideology, um, a very clear ideology, a neoliberal ideology has sort of dominated even kind of, more ancient traditions like Christianity. I think, shows how powerful the ideology that we're facing is. So absolutely trying to find ways to, you know, encourage and grow out of those social structures that exist. But I mean, like, I grew up in that world. I don't go to church. I'm not a part of those communities anymore. But I'll tell you from people who I know who are still in them, I mean, it's an uphill fight, right? It's not like we're just sitting here and sort of, there's all these Christian socialists waiting to join the socialist movement. There's plenty of Christian socialists who are in churches or, in congregations where those messages aren't, sort of seen. Like, what I'm saying is, like, it's a fight within all of these different communities, just like it's a fight to sort of rebuild communities outside of work for a lot of us. So yeah, I mean, finding ways to leverage that is good, but it's an uphill battle. Are you interested in, Lee says, are you interested in Marxism, Leninism, and if so, why? I mean, if you mean by that, am I interested in Lenin and Lenin's writings? Absolutely. I talk about Lenin a decent amount, and Matt and I are actually going to have a whole episode coming up probably in the next month on Lenin and electoralism and sort of early, Bolsheviks thinking towards that. So look out for that if that's something that you're interested in. But when I'm talking about that, I mean like the actual ideologies and social movements, less so, I don't know, kind of like online subcultures. Has anyone else seen that Damnation show? I thought it had a pretty good exploration of union strikebreakers and Christian socialism. I've really been enjoying that show, Matt. It's on Netflix right now. I can't remember the name of the writer of the show, but I think they sort of hang out in lefty circles if they're not a leftist themselves. I just say that because there are plenty of shows that, and for people who aren't familiar, Damnation is a pretty interesting show about a group of dairy farmers and corn farmers in Iowa who at the urging of their pastor, who is essentially, a communist agitator, go on strike and refuse to sell milk and corn to the conglomerates and the merchant class, essentially, which is the merchant class is sort of holding them out and paying them really, really low prices. So they all go on strike and refuse to sell, and it just sort of breaks down the social crisis there. Anyways, I think it's really good, and I like it a lot because a lot of times when communists are sort of introduced in those period pieces, it's always like, oh, well, look at these communists who were, they had a great idea, but they're sort of out of touch and they don't realize what it means at the end of the day when people fall through. I think that it actually, I haven't finished the show yet, but I've been enjoying the way that it treats that struggle. All right. Damnation rules. Hell yeah. I'm glad. Yeah, I'm really hoping to watch more of this. All right. A Caster says state and revolution, what is to be done, as well as imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, are also must reads for socialists. I think so. I mean, like, Lenin is is not a own. Lenin's a really interesting thinker because unlike a lot of theorists, he was also a revolutionary, which is a very rare thing for people to sort of be able to write at the length and the clarity, and the expansiveness that Lenin was able to, while also being somebody who put those ideas into practice. I mean, his, there's a lot to there's certainly a lot to sort of investigate with Lenin. One thing that I always enjoy about reading Lenin and sort of understanding him as a historical figure is that for him, as it should be, Marxism was not some kind of stagnant, dormant philosophy that just sort of sat and didn't move, but it was very dynamic. And he was very, very good at, for example, you read his essay, like ultra leftism, like an infantile disorder, right? He sort of also was able to push back against people who were so like hard line leftists that they were not able to sort of see what was going on around them, right? They were so dogmatic. They were unable to see the kind of political opportunities and movements of society around them. I think Lenin's ability to sort of be like an actual, Marxist in the true sense, but also to not be so dogmatic, right, that you can't see the world around you. I mean, is why he's such an influential and interesting thinker. And yeah, we're gonna do some really interesting stuff with it. I'm very gonna be very curious to see sort of how um, what Matt's saying about this, feeling about this too. Um, Should progressive Dems reject the 1.2 trillion infrastructure bill, and why are people defending billionaires possibly getting taxed? Well, the second part is because we have a very delusional society, unfortunately. And the first answer is yes. I mean, I think that decoupling these bills is a disaster. I will say, give them credit. In the House, I thought that was good that AOC and Ilhan and a lot of them voted no. I mean, I think that took courage. It was something that I was advocating for. So I'm happy to see it because look, we have to start drawing those lines in the sand. If Biden is going to deliver just mass disappointment to people, um, um, like if Biden just can deliver mass disappointment to people, I think it's really important that people don't, you know, associate socialism or democratic socialism with that movement either. Um, Radium says an example would be, how do you argue social change to conservatives without showing your ideological beliefs in such a way that is alienating? Well, I think talking clearly to people about stuff is crucial. I mean, it's not exactly a one to one, but here in Texas, Ryan Pollock, he's an organizer here, he had a great piece in Jackman. I can't remember the other publication about how he was able to get environmental policy endorsed by the AFL-CIO, a just transition, a more radical, kind of climate plan than we have right now. And he's able to do that, one, by talking to people directly about like their material needs. And you have to remember, you're talking to people, Texas AFL-CIO. I mean, that means you're talking to fossil fuel workers, right? And you read that piece, and the way that he was able to do it was, one, by being straight up and honest with people, reminding them of their class position, right, rather than focusing so much on like the social and cultural stuff. Saying like, look what happens to the bosses when things go bad, they get taken care of, and look at what happens to you, you get screwed. And I think more and more we're seeing that, especially when it comes to things like Green New Deal stuff, that it's becoming very clear that union workers and workers in general are going to be screwed over by a transition, while the people at the very top of it are going to to get away with golden parachutes. And we need to be advocating with folks that we're not just trying to cut them out, working people, like high and dry, and make them lose their income and livelihood, but we actually have a better solution, and that they'll not only continue making the kind of money that they're making today, but potentially even increase it, right? And arguing with people on that level was very successful. I believe in that situation, he dropped the Green New Deal phrasing, instead called it like federal environmental policy, but the planks were there. And it sort of stopped it from people who sort of inoculated, because for whatever cultural reasons they don't like people like AOC, etc. It blocked that stuff, and they were able to talk to people directly. I think that that's a good way to go about these things. All right. Let's see. Do I think that socialists should avoid using insular terms like dialectical materialism, proletariat to appeal to normies? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think not to pat myself on the back too much, I think that I do a pretty good job at, using terminology when it's good and appropriate to use it, and not using it in a way that's alienating. I mean, I think that this is less of a political question and more of a social question. And I think, learning that balance is crucial. I don't think this kind of fixation, some people like, if we just rebranded everything, we'd be living in a different society. People think, well, instead of calling it socialism, we'll call it something different. I think it's people can also tell when you're sort of um, you know BSing them and trying to hide something. but yeah, I think I think just trying to be normal. I mean, like, there's a lot of like points where it's like, okay, well, this is like a school of thought. Dialectical materialism is like um, a school of thought. Teaching people that school of thought, using that terminology in that context is worthwhile. Speaking in a way that is only intelligible to people who are in your reading group in a public forum isn't good. I mean, but this, what I'm saying is like, this is less of a political question, more of like a, I don't know, social etiquette, like how to talk to people. And I don't think that, well, I think there's a lot of people who do that. I don't think that that's the biggest problem that we see right now. Because I don't think people are talking about are talking to people in public that much, and that's probably even more of a problem. All right, I'm going to get back to some questions, but before we get there, um, I wanted to play this Obama clip because it's pretty. I mean, frankly, it's classic. It's just classic Obama. It shows exactly what his politics were, what they continue to represent. Um, and it's so frustrating to watch this one in the context of what's going on. This is him, bloviating at COP, about how we should be dealing with the climate crisis. So somebody who used to be the president of the United States, who came in with super majorities and the ability to tackle a hell of a lot of things, who utterly failed at delivering any kind of significant climate change policy, right? This is the words of advice that he has for the rest of us.
Protests are necessary to raise awareness. Hashtag campaigns can spread awareness. But to build the broad-based coalitions necessary for bold action, we have to persuade people who either currently don't agree with us or are indifferent to the issue. And to change the minds of those fellow citizens in our respective countries, we have to do a little more listening. We can't just yell at them or say they're ignorant. We can't just tweet at them. It's not enough to inconvenience them through blocking traffic in a protest. We actually have to listen to their objections and understand the reluctance of some ordinary people.
Just amazing. As if the reason that we don't have serious action on climate policy, right, is because the left is too loud and too mean and too rude, right? We're over here trying to get the president of the United States, just like we were trying to get the former president of the United States, the man who was just speaking, Barack Obama, to take this crisis seriously. We talked, I talked last week about how even within Biden's climate plans, right, which everyone is focusing on the dollar amount, it is still fundamentally tied primarily to tax credits and subsidies to deal with mass decarbonization, right? Meaning that it is still, even the inadequate amount of funding that's going toward, greening our economy, it's still tied to these failed market mechanisms that leave all of the power in the hands of the fossil fuel companies and the private power corporations, right? Who are the forces that drive, climate devastation today, right? As if the problem today that we're facing when it comes to dealing with climate change was that we had consensus from the state, right? We had consensus from the president and the government on action. And we're just trying to convince the last few holdovers in private society. What we have seen from Joe Biden is a complete refusal to understand the severity of the crisis. Biden now, because it's not popular to do this anymore, right? Biden now will say that climate change is real, but within his own plan. The way that these subsidies are set up means that coal companies, right, will be made viable for the next 12 years in a way that they wouldn't without the Biden subsidies. Why? Because they are set up that if you do enough kind of carbon capture shit, you can get enough tax credits that goes into their bottom line essentially, right? Basically, there is a refusal to take this crisis seriously from Obama and from Biden. So it's amazing to see him acting like the problem is not people like him and people like Joe Biden who come into power saying that they want to address these things, right? But it's actually that y'all are too loud and you're doing too many things and you're too worked up and you need to calm down, right? Again, it's like the hypocrisy and the nastiness is clear. The thing that's so funny to me about the Obama stuff is it's just like, remember when he did his "don't boo vote" shit? It's like that's not convincing anybody, right? Even if you thought that was a good thing to convince more people to participate in the process. Um, it's for all of these people who already do what they're told. The people Obama is talking to there are people who are willing to go and participate in a conference like that had, you know, if I remember correctly, more oil and gas lobbyists than representation from the global South, right? Those are the people he's speaking to there and saying, yeah, you know what the problem is? It's the protesters, right? To the people in fucking power. That's Obama's message. To the people in power, the problem is the protesters and the intensity of the message and the seriousness with which people take it. What a fucking joke. I would imagine that at this point, most people have seen through this stuff. But boy, it always is a rude reminder of just how reactionary and conservative Obama's politics were and continue to be. To sit here and say the problem, I mean, just like when he was saying the problem when Trump was coming into power, right? When it was starting to look like he was going to be able to knock down one of the most unpopular presidential candidates. The problem was that the people who care about this world and they want to make sure that people no longer go hungry or without healthcare in the United States of America. Those people are the problem, not people like him and not people like Joe Biden who get power and say, you have to elect us or else the bad guys are going to come and they're going to do bad things to you, right? And then they get into power, the Democrats get into power, and they do jack shit. And they just continue to allow these problems to fester because they're playing the same games as the Republicans. They are in bed with the same kind of people. They depend on the same kind of campaign donations as Republicans do, right? So they have to find a different kind of message. And their message, unlike the Republicans who are just like, let the world burn, it doesn't matter. The Obama people are like, we care so much about this, but we can't do everything, so we're not going to do anything. Just a joke. All right, I might take a couple more, and then I'll just save some energy for tomorrow. Have I read Donut Economics or Mission Economy? Donut's been translated into 26 language. Yeah, it's been a little bit. I think that the kind of the donut economics makes an argument that I don't particularly agree with, right? Which is I don't like. So I don't when it comes to climate change stuff. Like I don't like degrowth models, right? And I don't think that the reason that we're in the situation right now is because we've become too equitable, right? And I don't see these things as necessarily tied. Intrinsically tied together. I know that she makes a progressive argument, right, for saying that like basically we're pursuing like there's so many resources in the world and the way that they're distributed right now are unequal and it's also causing mass climate catastrophe. But the solution needs to be a way that we can utilize less resources and distribute them more equitably. I just don't find that to be sort of in line with a kind of socialist or Marxist perspective, right? Because what we really need to be doing is actually growing exponentially, but growing in ways that are beneficial to the vast majority of humanity and not just to the kind of profit motive of fossil fuel companies. But anyways, happy to hear more about it. But that's just sort of my. It's been a couple of years since I've engaged with it, but sort of my general thoughts on it. Theoretically, if a general strike happened, what should we fundamentally advocate for if we are to preserve democracy in any form? I don't know what you mean. Do you mean if a general strike just happened, what should we be saying to it, like to the general strike? I mean, I think if you're in a socialist movement and you're outside of that movement speaking to it, you've already lost. Um, um, right? I'm not 100% sure what you mean. I mean, I think the general strike stuff is fairly pie in the sky right now, in the sense that, like, it's not a reflection of what our conditions are right now. I mean, if this stuff is serious to you, if, the idea of a general strike is serious to you, start participating in these movements that we're doing right now to make sure that this very critical, but by historical standards still small, increase in like labor agitation and strikes across the country, find ways to support them. Because if people want to talk about things like a general strike and we're unable to support people in targeted industries right now who are going on strike, you're way ahead of yourself. If we're not able to support the people who are already doing strikes today, like through strike support and donating to strike funds, I mean, we have no business talking about general strike. So if that's the thing that's important to folks, I think that's where your energies and attention should be. But I might have misunderstood your question. Let me see. Okay. Sorry, it's hard for me to keep up when there's like everyone's engaging in the chat. I'm happy that people are talking, but I can't follow what everyone's talking about. All right. Okay. I think there's too much going on for me to follow what's going on in the chat to be able to comment on it or anything like that. So I think we're going to roll. I'll see y'all tomorrow. I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about South Carolina tomorrow. We're going to be talking about Nikki Haley, why that state has a large influence on American politics, and some of the positive movements that we're seeing in society. So I know we have a few people who are in like the Charleston and Columbia area. So I'm hoping that this will be enjoyable to y'all. We'll be talking with Paul Bowers, who runs a really great Substack called Brutal South. So that will be on it tomorrow at 7 Central, along with plenty more. And we'll be seeing everybody later this week for our bonus episode. I don't know off the top of my head right now what we have planned for that, but if you're interested, join us on patreon.com/leftreckoning for that. We had a really fun think tank. Matt and I debated veganism. We never really debate veganism, but we had conversations about how socials should consider questions like meat eating and factory farming. I thought that was a lot of fun. We talked about why MBA owners are jackasses, along with many more topics. So I'm looking forward to that. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Take care.